Hello and welcome to the programme that is, after 2 years of COVID restrictions, able to bring together again BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast from the Dateline London. With me in the studio are Stephanie Baker, senior writer at Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Business Week, Mark Roche, Belgian economist and journalist who writes for the French news magazine Le Point, and Clive Murray, BBC News presenter and long-standing foreign correspondent. As the song goes, it's so nice to have you all back where you belong. Thank you very much for coming in. Now, how to read the last 7 days in Ukraine. On the one hand, Russia has been shelling residential areas of Kyiv and now attacking Lviv as well, heightening fears that it was about to surround the capital city. On the other, signs of progress in the talks between the two countries. Whisper it softly, has sanctioning the Russian economy begun to work? Stephanie, you've been looking for Bloomberg at the sanctions situation. Are they starting to have an impact? And what are the problems that still remain?
Well, clearly they've had an immediate impact on the Russian economy. The ruble crashed. Russia's on the verge of a default. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs in Russia. And there's been this huge brain drain. Russians fleeing. I think 200,000 Russians have fled just in the first 10 days of the invasion. So in that sense, it's obviously had an immediate impact, and things like freezing, Russia's central bank reserves and cutting banks out of the international payment system has had a huge impact. Whether or not that's actually had an impact on Putin's calculation of the war remains to be seen. I think you're seeing a slight dial back in the demands from the Kremlin recently when you're talking about peace talks and the possibility of a peace deal. But that looks to me more like the fact that they've miscalculated on the invasion and encountered far more resistance from the Ukrainians than they were expecting, not because of the impact of sanctions. The problem with sanctions is they take a long time to really have any kind of an effect. Maybe they're looking forward to how long can we sustain this. And it's true that the Russians are sustaining huge losses in Ukraine, both in terms of billions of dollars of military equipment, thousands of lives lost. The U.S. estimates that 7,000 Russian soldiers died. But sanctioning the oligarchs and, these moves against the Russian economy, I think that's going to take a little bit more time to feed through.
You've spoken to somebody who is a very wealthy Russian living in London this week. What's his experience? Has he felt it directly yet?
Right. So I interviewed Mikhail Friedman. He's a billionaire who was born in Ukraine but made his money in Russia and lives in London, running a private equity firm. He was sanctioned by the EU on the 28th of February and then again by the UK in the most recent round of sanctions. And as a result, he has no access to cash. He's a billionaire without money, essentially, and has to apply to the UK government for a license in order to spend money. And the UK government can decide what is, quote unquote, reasonable. And indications are that amount was something like £2,500 a month, which if you were worth 14 billion before the war, now he's worth 10 billion on paper. But that's
10 billion he can't get his hands on.
That's quite a dramatic downfall. Yeah. And I think his view was they want me to go back to Russia, but I don't want to go back to Russia. And if you see the comments that Putin made this week, he had this chilling speech this week calling on, traitors and the West backing a fifth column of Russians who'd made their money in Russia but were living abroad. And it was kind of directed at people like him. Russia's returning to a very dark place that has the overtones of Stalinism. And, I think it's hard to see how the sanctions will play out for people like that who don't want to go back. I think some of the sanctioned oligarchs will go back to Russia, and there's a possibility it could backfire and strengthen him, because that's what Putin always wanted. He always wanted all those Russians to come back.
Yes, ideally bring their resources, but even if they can't do that, at least physically bring them home. Clive, you've been in Ukraine, you spent some time in Ukraine during this war. Is there much confidence, much faith among Ukrainians you met that sanctions are going to deliver the goods for them?
No, they're not thinking about sanctions at all. If they do, they might think, yes, it's nice that the West is doing something. What they want is boots on the ground. They want a no-fly zone. They want potentially, when it comes to sanctions, a trade blockade, for instance. That might be something that might prick up the ears of your average Ukrainian. But no, ultimately what they want is force to be applied. And I agree with Stephanie, the sanctions take a long time to bed in. The suggestion is that at some point GDP could fall anything. I think JP Morgan suggesting 12%. Some estimates put it at 30%.
35%.
35%, yeah, absolutely.
Global GDP, we're talking.
No.
Russian
GDP,
yeah.
because of the sanctions.
Yeah.
Now that is crippling. That's
Yeah.
taking the country back to the 1990s. But does Putin care about that? Yes, but he'd rather have military success. And it's the fact that the troops are having problems on the ground, bogged down. And the Americans are sending in these stingers. The British are sending in anti-tank weapons. It's all flooding in on that western border from the NATO countries.
Action against the
Which is
business.
why you're seeing that in the last sort of 3-4 days. Attacks on that air maintenance base, not far from the Polish border, and the barracks there too, and the military office as well. A reminder to the West that you're supplying these Ukrainians with all these weapons. You are directly in our line of fire. But it's the fact that he's bogged down in Ukraine that's changing perhaps the perception of this war for him, and not really, I think at this moment, sanctions.
On the question of sanctions, the other problem, I guess, Mark, is sanctions busting. Now, France has form on this question, doesn't it, in the past, both towards South Africa but also towards Russia. Tell us a bit about the history of that.
Well, France did what most countries who have a defense industry, which is creating masses of jobs, is doing. It's selling arms, whatever the political coloration is. So they did it in South Africa. It was at the
So that was arms for wine or wine for arms.
whatever it was, and they did it to Russia. They were not the only one doing it. The problem with sanction, because I've been working on sanction on Russian diamonds in Antwerp, is that they don't work because they are circumvented. In the case of diamonds, the Russian diamond is forbidden by EU, by US, but in practice, Israel, China, and India are helping the Russian by putting all the Russian diamond together with other diamonds and then selling to Antwerp, because you can't see the difference
They look
between
the
a
same.
Russian,
Yeah.
a Canadian, or an African diamond. And that shows that sanctions are not working, except long term. And I believe the sanctions which are really working are the financial one through the payment system and the central banks.
It's that lack of access to that sort of that fund, 630 billion he put away, squirreled away
So he could-
for a war.
He could defend the
Central
ruble as
bank
needed.
Yeah, central bank can't touch it, which is, the way to apply sanctions.
And because even on the sanctions are in party, like countries like the United States, there are exceptions being made, aren't there? I mean, where individuals are being sanctioned, but maybe their businesses aren't because of fears about the consequences of damaging the businesses, employment, and all the rest of it.
Right. If you look at the oligarchs who were sanctioned, it's remarkable that some have been targeted and some have escaped mysteriously. I mean, Russia's richest man, Vladimir Putin, you would think might be on the list, that he might be somehow close to the Kremlin, but he has not been sanctioned, and that's because he owns a big chunk of Norilsk nickel, which is a big nickel producer. Likewise, the U.S. and the U.K. and the EU sanctioned Alisher Usmanov, who used to own part of Arsenal and now part of Everton. They sanctioned him, blocked his yacht, various things, but then turned around and gave a special license for some of his companies to continue trading, because I think they're worried about disruption in the metals market. And because they learned that in 2018 when the US sanctioned Oleg Deripaska, and they didn't realize by sanctioning him they were sanctioning Rusal, which is one of the world's biggest aluminum producers, and that caused mayhem in the aluminum markets. And so I think they're very wary of market disruption
France has been at the forefront of the sanction this time because Macron is president of the EU. So Macron has been the coordinator of all the EU tough sanctioning, much more than Britain, and at the level of the US. And of course, it's very difficult to get all EU 27 members because you have the hardliner, which are mostly the Eastern European, and then Germany, Finland, who depends on gas from Russia. And you have to find a compromise. And I find that the French this time have done really well as head of the EU, and the proof is Macron in his ratings have gone from 23% to 31%.
But that, of course, is the ultimate sanction, isn't it? It's cutting off oil, and it's cutting off gas. And if you did that, maybe Putin would listen.
And all we have at the moment is promises to do it by the end of the year or a year's time at the EU and UK level, as we talked about last week. Clive, talk us a little bit, if you would, about the experience that Ukrainians are living with at the moment. Those who have stayed in the country, those obviously in Kiev where you were, who've been trying to stay in their homes. Obviously many have left, but as many must have remained.
It's hell. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, you know, you've got places like Kharkiv, Mariupol, Odessa that are under siege. Access is cut off, which means food, supplies, water, medicines, all that kind of stuff cannot get in. Most cities, big cities around Ukraine now, are full of old people or very young people. Older men are away fighting, and it's mainly women and children who've been spirited out of the country as refugees to Moldova, Poland, and so on. And it's a nightmare for these people not knowing what the future holds. I mean, they're constantly in underground basements. Life is lived subterraneously now across many big cities because of the fear of air raids and so on. And there's just a sense that at some point there will be a concerted land push into these areas, and then what happens? And that's the big fear. I mean, this is. I mean, I've covered a number of conflicts through my career, and this is two big modern armies going at each other with the help from the outside. This is not Yemen, this is not Bosnia, this is not a number of conflicts that have sort of risen in infamy over the last 20, 30 years. This is the 1930s, 1940s in the heart of Europe. It's really quite astonishing.
Stephanie, Joe Biden announced this week additional military help, I think $800 million. He was very keen to stress that some of that money, if not a large part of it, was going to be on anti-aircraft operations, presumably a kind of a signal to Ukraine, to his NATO allies in Europe, that having blocked Poland transferring its aircraft via the States to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians, that he was doing something concrete. Do you think it will have been enough to kind of pacify those frustrations, which some even in US Congress seem to feel at the moment about the limits of what America and other countries are prepared to do?
Right. I mean, he's trying to do as much as he possibly can without antagonizing Putin further. President Zelensky gave this address to members of Congress this week and, underscoring the need for additional help. I think the military support is the least that they can do, and there's probably more they can do. It looks like this prospect of getting the MiGs in is completely off the table, even though, the Ukrainians are saying we need it. But they're doing incredibly well just with the anti-aircraft equipment that they've got. I mean, some of it I think they need still training on, some of the new stuff that is being supplied. But I think that, the US and Europe, they're doing absolutely everything they can in terms of sanctions and military support, because they don't want to get involved in a direct military confrontation with a nuclear power.
But the problem is Germany, isn't it? As Zelensky address to the Bundestag has shown, Germany is very reluctant to force the EU to help more Ukraine, because of their reliance on gas, because the fact that it's a coalition where you have the Greens, so there could be no return to nuclear. They've done a great effort with defense by increasing, but that takes time. Yeah. And on the whole, the the Germans are really, for the first time in Europe, in the EU, completely in the back. They are not participating.
Now, just on the NATO side, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, announced this week there's going to be a special summit on the 24th of March. Joe Biden says he's coming to that, which presumably is an indication about the need for some face time again between the NATO partners. Is there any prospect, do you think, of that signalling any kind of change of approach by NATO?
Well, obviously, there will be a much tougher attitude because of the pressure of public opinion in every country, which absolutely discussed about what we are seeing on television and the refugees and all that. The problem again is Germany, because if Biden doesn't persuade Schulz to get along with all the Europeans, the Eastern Europeans, to reinforce Ukraine, Europe won't be able to do more. So the US I think, will not do more either. And as a consequence, it might be a missed opportunity, this NATO meeting.
Just picking up on that point, I think you are going to see a shift with NATO's attitude. And I think what NATO has been doing since this war began is say what it's not willing to do. I think you're going to start seeing a bit more of a proactive move towards saying what they will do.
Because I was wondering, why does President Zelensky keep banging on about a no-fly zone when he knows they're not going to give him that?
Yeah, but there may be levels beneath that.
Right.
And it may well be that, you hear certain announcements that might suggest that there's going to be a little bit more active a role. But Stephanie's absolutely right. The last thing you want is annoying a nuclear power with someone at the helm who's willing to push the button. Now, compared to Leonid Brezhnev or Gorbachev or any of the former Soviet leaders, none of them, I suspect, were willing to press the button. I think there's a belief that Putin might be one of those guys.
And there is part of an aspect here, isn't there? Because Putin he's not a leader who was born during the war. He's of that generation who don't remember that, as most of our leaders don't now. And certainly in Soviet times, where leaders tended to be older, not almost universally, but mostly, presumably that is a significant change. Somebody who doesn't remember what total war is like and what it did to Europe.
In the
Khrushchev, of course,
back off.
He backed off.
Which was a great.
And he didn't remain leader for very long, which may be another lesson.
I don't know if that's really the issue that might push Putin over the edge or not. I think there are other things going on.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about, there's been some signs of hope that maybe we could get some sort of negotiated peace deal. But, people think about it as, the Ukrainians and the Russians sitting down across that table. But the other party is NATO, the US. They can't do a deal without, some sort of, for instance, I don't think Russia would sign up to any kind of deal without a promise to roll back at least some of the sanctions. Maybe say, if the Russians decide, agree to withdraw some of their troops in exchange for the lifting of the restrictions and the freezing on central bank reserves.
That would have to be part of the deal, I would have thought.
So it's not a very simple calculation or negotiation, because there's this other thing hanging over the negotiations that could influence it.
Is that your sense as well, Mark, that Putin is not interested in a deal, not at all, just right now on these terms? Because some of the mood music this week has been a lot more positive, and I mean, effectively, it looked like President Zelensky was conceding neutrality.
Yes, I mean that Ukraine is neutral will be for sure that they won't join the EU. It was never a question to join NATO anyway. It's an excuse of
It's kind of an Aunt Sally using
the question of neutrality.
Something to knock down.
Yeah, the question of neutrality is de facto guarantee. The problem is that you could have a situation of World War I situation, a complete military stalemate, and then that won't push Putin to, because he'll be quite happy with the separation de facto between East and West Ukraine, so that won't push him to compromised.
I mean, in a sense that, I mean, Boris Johnson said it this week, the British Prime Minister, Nick Clive, that he thinks the terrible mistake was 2014, when the West didn't do enough to respond to the annexation of Crimea. And having already accepted that part of Ukraine is not part of Ukraine anymore, it's quite hard to go to, bluntly, to go to war over, let's say, Donetsk and Luhansk.
I mean, look, he's starting with Ukraine. I would go back, with Crimea,
Yes.
sorry, I would go back to 1999 and Chechnya, frankly.
Yeah.
I would go to Aleppo and Syria.
Yes.
I mean, you know, we had all this stuff, didn't we, with Ben Wallace talking about appeasement at
Yes.
the beginning
Yep.
of the war.
Yep.
The appeasement began
Yes.
in 1999. It is as simple as that, when Grozny was leveled. And that is where the West fell down on its own principles
Yes.
and everything that it believes it stands for. For some reason, none of that mattered when it came to massacring people in Chechnya, and that is where this whole crisis starts.
You know, I think the real question here is, this only ends with some sort of negotiated settlement. And, you know, what Russia has demanded, which is recognition of Crimea as Russian territory, allowing Donetsk and Luhansk to be recognized as independent states, and neutrality for Ukraine. Now, the neutrality for Ukraine that's the easy part, right? All those two other things are really, really hard for Zelensky to accept. And I don't see how you get to a deal without solving those two things and him saving face. So you have a situation where Putin needs an off-ramp, but, you know, Zelensky needs a deal that he can sell to the public. And in a weird way, Putin has an easier time. He can try to dress up whatever deal he gets and deploy his propaganda machine to sell it, to say it's a triumph.
You know.
And, you know, no one, the access to independent media has been completely cut off in Russia. So he has a much easier time.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainian people say, look, we've gone through all this. My house destroyed, my family destroyed, you know, cities leveled. We go through all this, and you give him Ukraine. Sorry, you give him Crimea, officially give him Crimea, and you give him that sort of, you know, quarter of the country in the east.
Hadn't they already done that with the deal that was negotiated in Minsk? Hasn't it? The Minsk process effectively done that anyway.
I think
de facto,
most,
not de jure.
I think realistically, most Ukrainians, you know, would not be expecting Crimea to be, you know, I think they've given up on it.
But Clive's point is an interesting one, isn't it? Because of what they've gone through
What they've
now,
suffered
that's
now.
changed almost.
Exactly, that's probably changed that calculation.
Possibly.
Yeah.
I think there's an even harder thing is look at the Russian advance in the south. They've actually made more gains than, you know, that's where they have been somewhat successful. So what do you do with Mariupol? I mean, they're trying to build this corridor. Is Putin really going to withdraw from those areas? Unlikely, highly unlikely. So, you know, there is one option of a negotiated settlement, but the other option, which is looking pretty likely, is that this grinds on for months and months, if not
And we
longer.
haven't mentioned China in all of this
No,
as
and
well.
I wanted to come on to this because Friday there was this discussion between President Putin and President Xi. I mean, that has huge potential. Is there a sense that the mere fact that they were willing to talk on this was...
Oh, you mean Biden and Xi?
Yeah, Biden and Xi.
Biden and Xi,
Sorry, forgive me. Biden and Xi, that they were willing to talk on this, because they haven't talked very much over the last few months. We've had one other phone call in. We had great efforts to get that. Is that a good sign? Is that a positive sign? Do they both have reason to want to get this resolved?
It is a positive sign, of course. I mean, the only way Russia escapes the punishing sanctions regime is if China comes and bails them out, either with potentially military support or buying more oil and gas and keeping the Russian economy going. So, you know, China is a really crucial player here. If they decide to, you know, help Russia out, this could go on for quite a long time.
But they are vulnerable to sanction, of course. If the West put the same sanction on China that they've put on Russia,
which is what Biden has threatened to do.
Which Biden has done, has threatened to do, that could work to make China hesitant to help Moscow.
But also the fact that Russia being in league with China, they had the, you know, a no-holds-barred pact just before the war started. I mean, does Xi want to be saddled with a loser? Does he want to be saddled with, you know, a Russia that is a pariah around the world, has sanctions on it, that is bringing down the prestige of the Chinese? I mean, this is a difficult decision that Xi has got to make. Does he stick with the guy he thought he had, or does he cut and run now?
Clive Murray, Stephanie Baker, Mark Rush, thank you all very much. Lovely to see you all here. Lovely to have your company too for Dateline London for this week. We'll be back around this table at the Sign Tome next week. But a good question for Clive Murray to leave us with there. Is Putin now a loser? Question we won't know the answer to for perhaps months to come. Goodbye.